delay for the Senate Education Committee meeting. At this time, I will ask, are there any bills for introduction? Senator Sykes.
I have one. It's RS 1126, and it's dealing with hazard pay for teachers.
Are there any questions? Does this have to do with COVID? Is it COVID related? Committee, is there any opposition? It's 1126. No opposition. That is accepted as a committee bill. Any other? I'm not seeing any. Committee, we are going to start on something a little bit different today, different from years past, in that we will be working on budget hearings for the Kansas Department of Ed, or Kansas State School for the Blind, and Kansas State School for the Deaf. And we are going to start with an orientation about the budget process. And so, who is starting that for us today? AG, are you there with us?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
We're going to kind of increase that volume so that we can hear you a little bit better. Do you want to say something again? Introduce yourself, maybe?
I can increase my microphone a little bit. Is that better?
Okay. It is better. Thank you so much. So let's go ahead and start with that orientation.
Okay. I will, first time, attempt to share my screen. So what we have is just a sample budget analysis. This is one from last year. So we'll kind of walk through the sections and then some of the terminology. Budget analysis is a review of the agency's request and the governor's recommendation, and it's prepared based on the governor's recommendation. So the very front table is a summary of state general funds. State general funds are funds that are coming in from normally our larger taxes, such as income tax, sales tax, corporate, compensating use. Taxes that can be used for anything that the state can spend the money on. So it's the very flexible money. That's the reason why we go ahead and maintain a separate accounting of all of the state general fund. In this table, we have then other funds. The other funds are also referred to sometimes as special revenue funds. The same thing. We have state general fund, we have special revenue funds or other funds. And then we have all funds. The all funds does include all of the state general fund expenditures. When we look through the document, after the front table, there'll be a major issues. There's also a brief overview of the agency. And then there'll be a list of some previous years' major issues, bills that have been passed, budget amendments that have been made, salary increases, different types of information that is somewhat important to take a quick look at. We then have a summary, a budget summary. You normally just a short little paragraph that summarizes what the agency requested and what the governor recommended. We have a short section on performance measures. We then go into a table and a graph that show 10-year trends. The top line, the dotted line, is the all funds expenditures. This would be from 2012 to the governor's recommendation for 21. This is last year's, remember. The solid line at the bottom is the state general fund. So for those that like pictures, we do have a graph. For those that like tables, we do have those same operating expenditures in a table with a percent change, and then how much that's changed over the previous 10 years. We then go into the summary of operating budget table. We refer to this sometimes as the aspirin table because every time we put it together, we usually cause a headache. but it's organized in 3 different parts. It has a summary of program information. And basically, the way I look at this looks at who is spending the money. So there's administration program, there's a instruction services program, support services, and it shows what they spent actually, what they estimated, what the agency estimated for 2020 and 2021, and what the governor recommended for 2020 and 2021. And it has a comparison. These comparisons compare agency to agency and governor to governor. One of the things that I do want to mention is a lot of the times when we look at budgets, we put things together in a summary fashion and summarize it based on certain types of categories. Uh, the bottom portion of this, the financing, is the revenue portion. We talked about the state general fund. We talked about special revenue funds or all other funds. When we look at the financing portion of this, you'll see state general fund is just that. And then it has federal funds separated out. Uh, those federal funds are special revenue funds, the same as fee funds. And some of that all other is including fee funds as well. After the operating budget, we get into the current year. The current year shows the change from the approved. There's certain adjustments that are made to the approved budget. Last year, the legislature approved a budget for 2021, and then we'll have a new estimate for 2022. The legislature pass it, and then it will be approved. But the approved state general fund expenditures can be increased and decreased. We'll talk about some allotments. That's where the governor went in because the projected ending balance for the end of the year was below zero. Constitutionally, that can't happen. So the governor reduced budgets in the executive branch to bring that ending balance up to zero. And you'll hear about those in the budget analysis. There's also, as in this case, reappropriations. Certain state general funds have language that says that the money can reappropriate. When we put a limitation on how much they can spend from the state general fund at the agencies, we call that an appropriation. If there's language to let it move from one year to the other, that's a reappropriation. So money that was not spent in the end of 2020, if it has that language in the appropriation bill, can move from 2020 into 2021, and the agency can spend that, and that would then increase their state general fund approved budget. There'll be some discussion on all of the adjustments that the agencies have made and what they've requested. And the same thing for the current year. The current year is the year that we're in. When we talk about fiscal years, sometimes it can get a little confusing on what fiscal year we're in. It runs from July through June. And the fiscal year is always the year in which the fiscal year ends. So currently, the fiscal year runs from July of 2020 to June of 2021. It ends in 2021. So this would be, the current year would be fiscal year 2021. And then when we talk about a budget year, that's one out year. That's the year after the current year. That would be fiscal year 2022. There are some biennial agencies that go out for another year, but the 3 that you have in this committee doesn't have any of the biennial budgets. There are times, and we'll have a discussion with that concerning consensus with Norma here shortly. A consensus is a process that's done for mainly school finance, for human services caseloads, and for the state general fund receipts. It's a process in which the Division of Budget, Legislative Research, and the agency that's dealing with the, in this case would be the K-12 schools, school board, would get together and estimate how much we believe the cost would be to fully fund the school finance formula. Um, so it's an agreement with those three groups that determine as best they can what those estimates will be. It's much easier if we can get a consensus on a lot of those rather than the governor talking about the estimate for school finance, the Board of Education talking about the funding for school finance, and the legislature funding school finance discussions. So anytime we can do that, it works out much better. There's also a quick section on salary and wage that will include some information this year on capers with the death and disability being postponed, and there's some longevity included and a salary increase. There's a quick section on funding sources. So this particular budget last year had almost 85% of its budget funded from the state general fund, about 8% from federal funds, and about 7.5% from other federal funds or all funds, mainly fee funds. Here is a fee fund analysis. It will talk about the beginning balances for 2020, the 2021 agency and governor's recommendation, 2022 governor's recommendation, and moving through. It will look at how much they expect in revenue, how much is available, and then expenditures. It'll also identify programs. For this particular one, at the beginning when we were looking at the budget table, we identified the 3 programs. Here are those 3 programs. It will identify the dollar amounts that the governor recommended, all funds in SGF, and then a percentage of the total budget that those funds consist of. It will identify the FTE. FTE are full-time equivalents. So if you have 2 part-time people, each working a half time, then as far as a full-time equivalent would be, that would be 1 FTE. So it's a portion of time that they actually work. And then we get into the different programs. And this is something that frequently we won't get into in the budget analysis presentations because they take a fair amount of time, but it's the same type of information that we just talked about. Performance measures. It'll have what this program is expending in these different categories: salary and wages, contractual services, commodities. Commodities are consumable items. Contractual services are basically not those that can consume, such as copier contracts, rent, mileage reimbursements. Capital outlay are fairly large expenditures for items. Aid to local units is funding that goes to taxing entities. So a school district has the ability to levy a property tax. So K-12 education expenditures going to the schools would be part of aid to local units. Sometimes there's assistance goes directly to people. That's other assistance, grants and benefits. Some examples would be some of the Medicaid payments, tuition payments, scholarships, are types of other assistance. And then how those are funded, once again, with the number of FTE. Capital improvements, you will find these capital improvements in the School for the Deaf and School for the Blind. Those are large expenditures that go to large projects that will last a period of time. So there's security systems. They had some boiler and heating and air conditioning upgrades. and then how those were financed. Once again, then what the agency requested and what the governor recommended. So just going through real quickly, that is a quick overview trying to give some basic information quickly on the budget process and the information that Norma will be presenting shortly. Normally, the process would include Norma doing presentation, the department, this time the Board of Ed, having a presentation along with the public giving some testimony if needed. Then after that, you would listen to the testimony, review, and make recommendations for changes to the budget. Noah went through a lot, but we have a lot to kind of get through today, so I thought I would get through some stuff quickly. Is there any questions?
What questions do you have? JG, I am going to ask you, while the committee is kind of putting together whether or not they have questions. So just on that first page, and so I'm talking about the first page of the Kansas School for the Blind, and it's going to be the one that says the actual is FY fiscal year 2019. So that's what JG was running through. It's going to be the smaller little packet. Do you have that, Representative Clues? So please go through and explain to the committee. We have in the columns the actual fiscal year 2019. Then we have the agency estimate fiscal year 2020, governor recommendation fiscal year 2020, agency request fiscal year 2021, and governor's recommendation fiscal year 2021. So share with the committee what those different columns represent, because actual fiscal year 2019 doesn't represent what was spent. It just represents what was actually budgeted. But could you go through each of those columns?
Sure. Actually, the actual FY 2019, and this is last year's,
Right?
is the actual expenditures that were made. So if we were going into the accounting system, it would reflect that the School for the Blind in 2019 on their operating expenditures spent $6.2 million. They had capital improvements of almost 560,000. So their total budget that they expended, not their approved, what they expended, was almost $6.8 billion.
Where would we find, if that's what was expended, where would we find what was budgeted? And whether that was over or under what was actually budgeted?
We have the appropriation report that we have put out, and while we're going through this, and if she doesn't already, we can get you the actual expenditures for the School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, and um, the Board of Education. We can give you the actual expenditures and the budgeted amount for 2020 and 2019 if you would like.
You can get that for us when we start the process today, as well as tomorrow and Wednesday. You can get us what was budgeted since
Sure.
we have expended, okay?
Sure.
And
And then
go ahead and
the
talk
next,
through the estimate and so forth.
right. So when we look at the 2020, remember that last year, the legislature approved budgets for 2020 and 2021. So what we have here would have been from the previous, so they would have already had an approved budget for 2020, and then this would be the first time they're making a recommendation for 2021. The agency will revise that amount that they think that they need for 2020. So the second column, agency estimate, is what they believe that they need to fully fund their budget. If they need more money, especially from State General Fund, you'll be hearing that as a supplemental request. So if they're wanting more, they'll have a supplemental request to bring additional appropriation money in. The all funds are just the totals. We don't keep as thorough track of those as far as changes from the approved. We just totaled those up. So the agency is now requesting $6.8 million for their operating budget for 2020 in this example. When you look at the governor's recommendation, both of these years, the governor agreed with the agency's request. So the governor made no changes to what the agency requested in this example for 2020 or 2021. If the governor made changes, the amount of money that the governor recommended would be put in here that would be different. And then later on, when we talk about the current year or the budget year, we will discuss the changes that the governor made to the agency's request. In the current year, we talk about supplementals on what the agency is requesting. In the out year, for this example, 2021, the agency went through the process of doing the same thing and estimating what they believe that their budget would be requiring us to fund the agency. There is normally in the 21 year an allocation, a number that the Division of Budget presents to the agencies on what their base budget should be. To that base, the agency sometimes will request enhancements. So an enhancement is funding that the agency is requesting above a base budget. Also included this year is a reduced resource budget. This year, the governor asked all of the executive branch agencies to submit a 10% reduced resource budget. So they would have listed what those items that they would change to reduce their 10%. The agency request that we show here includes all of the agency's enhancements already. So if the agency asked for a request, in our analysis, we put that money in. If the governor did not recommend an agency enhancement, we would not put that money in the governor's recommendation. So, for example, the agency, I'm making this up, in 2021 had an enhancement for $1 million for salaries. This sample that we have here would say that the agency requested it and the governor recommended it. If the governor didn't recommend it, the agency's $5.8 million would have that enhancement included, and the governor's recommendation would no longer be that 5.7 or 5.8 million. It would be $1 million less because she didn't recommend that enhancement. So when we look at this table, broken out by state general fund and special revenue funds, by operating and capital improvements, we compare what was actually spent last fiscal year to what the agency is requesting this fiscal year, comparing that to what the governor is recommending, and then identifying the request for 2021 and what the governor is recommending. At the bottom, you'll see the percent changes from the previous fiscal year. And once again, this compares agency request to agency request, governor's recommendation to governor's recommendation. In this, you'll see that the agency spent 2.2% more in state general fund in 19 than they did in 18 actuals. The estimate is 3.8 million or 3.8% more than the 2019 actual. The governor, 3.8 million or 3.8% more than the 19 actual. Agency request is 1.7% more than the agency's 2020 request, or 3.8%. And the governor's recommendation for FY21 is again 1.7% more than the governor's recommendation. So that's kind of how this tables are presented, and that's how the entire document is really put together. I do want to mention that when we look at making any changes, the governor submits a budget. She puts that into an appropriation bill, and that, the governor's recommendation, is the base for everything that's done. So when we talk about the governor's recommendation, those items that are identified in here is what will start off in the budget appropriation bill. So anytime something has to be changed, they'll be changing the governor's recommendation. So if the governor didn't recommend it, it will not be in the appropriation bill. And if you want to add it, you'll have to add money to the governor's recommendation. If the governor added money to something that the committee doesn't want, then they would be deleting money from the governor's recommendation. So everything that we're changing is changing based off of the governor's recommendation.
Any questions, committee? Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, JG, I noticed that you have adjustments to the approved state general fund. And so how, in this case, how do adjustments occur?
I'm sorry, you froze up.
I'm sorry. On page 4, you have reflected adjustments to the state general fund budget, the approved state general fund budget. So, and this is just a small one, but how would adjustments occur by way of the agency?
Okay, if the agency asked for a supplemental, say that they had some new positions that need to be funded, then they would add money to their approved budget. They would request money from their approved budget to fund $100,000 for a supplemental to provide, 1.5 FTE positions. So that $100,000 would show as, instead of this case, 5,693, it would be 5,793. Change from approved would be $100,000. And then down below, we would explain what that $100,000 would be for. And then the governor's recommendation would either include that and remain $100,000 above the approved, or not approve it, and it would be 0. And then in the supplemental chart or table below, it would show that the governor did not recommend that supplemental.
Any other questions? Not seeing any. I think that we are ready to move into the budget hearing. We'll start with the Kansas State Department of Education, and so we have a staff briefing on the budget. Norma, are you there with us? Norma Volkmer?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
You can, thank you.
All right. And in front of you, you should have 2 pieces of paper. First, I'll start. I'm Norma Volkmer. I'm a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research, and I have the budgets for the Department of Education, School for the Blind, School for the Deaf, and the State Library. In front of you, you should have a very bright orange piece of paper, and it should say Budget Committee and Subcommittee Report Out Procedure. So there is a slightly different procedure. After you hear budgets, there is a budget recommendation process to move the budget out of this committee. This details the procedure for this year. So traditionally, there is a subcommittee report, and there is a signature sheet, and we seek out the signatures of everyone on the committee, just showing that they agree with whatever recommendations have come out of the committee and agree that it should move forward in the process. This year, to limit in-person contact, I will be emailing out the subcommittee report, and it'll have all of the recommendations. And you'll simply need to respond to that email, letting me know. Again, with agreement, agreement is not necessarily that you agree with the budget, simply that you agree the budget was heard, the recommendations were made by the committee, and that it was agreed to move out of this committee and move forward into Senate Ways and Means. So that details that procedure. Your second one should be a packet entitled Department of Education. This is the Department of Education budget analysis, and this will form the basis of my testimony today. So on the front, I'll just note that there is an overview of the agency, and I will note that Craig Nineswander, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Fiscal and Administrative Services, is here as well, and he'll be presenting after this. The Department of Education is overseen by the State Board of Education, which is elected and has 10 members. The duties of the state board include accrediting elementary and secondary schools, establishing standard courses of study, certifying teachers and administrators, and approving public and private education programs, as well as administering state and federal aid programs. And the board appoints a commissioner of education, and that's who's responsible for the administration of the Department of Education. And the current commissioner is Randy Watson. Moving on, the next few pages include, as JG pointed out, major issues, budget summary and key points. And then on page 758, you'll see the performance measures. There are 4 performance measures laid out here. These are just kind of the key highest performance measures. There are a number of performance measures in the program detail later on in the budget analysis as well. And I will note that that second performance measure is the average statewide ACT score. There was a decrease in fiscal year 2019, and it was projected to stay at a lower score in fiscal year 2020 and 2021 due to more students taking the ACT. And that's just because the legislature appropriated funding to pay for every high school student to take the ACT one time for free. Then the next few pages include operating expenditures over the 10 years. I'll note that the education's budget analysis is slightly different. There are 2 10-year tables. The first is for operating expenditures, including those in the children's cabinet. And the second is for aid and other assistance. You'll note that aid and other assistance is the major portion of the Department of Education's budget. Then you have the summary of operating budget on 761. And I'll be starting my overview on page 762. Should be entitled Budget Overview, Fiscal Year 2021, Current Year. All right, and I'll note that there were 2 changes to the approved budget. First, there was an increase of about $4.5 million of reappropriation funding that was not spent in fiscal year 2020 and shifted into fiscal year 2021. There was also a decrease of about $130 million as a result of the governor's allotments. Below the change from approved table, I'll note that the agency requests a revised estimate of $5.7 billion, including $4 billion SGF in fiscal year 2021. This is a special revenue fund increase of about $105.7 million, or 1.9%. And that increase is primarily due to federal funding received under the CARES Act in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the awarding of a new federal preschool development birth through 5 grant to the Children's Cabinet. I do provide kind of an overview of the major CARES Act funding received. I will note that this does not include the most recent budget package from Congress that was appropriated at the end of December. So this is just CARES Act. You have child nutrition, and then the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund broken down into its 3 major expenditure categories. And on page 763, you'll note that the governor recommends revised expenditures of $5.7 billion, including $3.9 billion SGF in fiscal year 2021. This is an all funds increase of $3.6 million, or 0.1%, and an SGF decrease of $30.1 million, or 0.8% below the agency's revised estimate. The governor's recommendation does include 261.9 FTE positions, which is the same as the agency's request. And these changes are primarily due to the allocation of $41.6 million from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund by the Spark Task Force to the Children's Cabinet, partially offset by the adoption of the Fall 2020 Education Consensus Estimates and the deletion of reappropriated funds. I will note that the governor's recommendation includes the full $41.6 million allocated to the Children's Cabinet. In November, $23.5 million of that was recouped by the Spark Task Force and allocated elsewhere. But this was there was a cutoff date, and it just the budgeting they included the full amount, but some of it was recouped, so you won't actually see that next year in the actuals. Still on 763, you'll see an outline of the Fall 2020 Education Consensus Estimates broken down by category. Overall, it's a decreased expenditures of $26.6 million, including $18.9 million SGF below the approved amount and below the agency's revised estimate. For CAPERS, the governor recommended decreased expenditures of $8.9 million, all SGF, below the approved amount and below the agency's revised estimate. And then there are the individual components. I can either go over those or I can move on to the allotments. Which would you prefer, Madam Chair?
Let's take a moment to see if there are any questions from committee. Committee, are there any questions from what you have heard so far? And let's just go through and why don't you address the allotments?
Certainly. So turning to page 765, you'll see the governor's allotments. The allotments totaled $130 million, and they included operating expenditures, CAPERS, the Mental Health Intervention Team Pilot Program, Career and Technical Education Transportation, Juvenile Transitional Crisis Center Pilot, School Safety and Security Grants, and a delayed state foundation aid payment. And I can pause for any questions on those.
Please address the CAPERS allotments.
Certainly. So there were two CAPERS allotments, the CAPERS employer contributions and the CAPERS USD's school employer contributions. This was part of the allotment plan, the overall allotment reduction for death and disability. The school finance estimates also note a decrease. That decrease is on top of these allotments. So the allotments here are all of that CAPERS death and disability that was part of a larger CAPERS death and disability allotment. The school finance estimates also had a decrease in CAPERS, and that was on top of that.
The Mental Health Intervention Team Pilot Program. So the allotment is $3.9 million. Can you address that, please?
Certainly. So the appropriated amount was about $12.5 million, I believe, for $12.7 million for fiscal year 2021 for the Mental Health Intervention Team Pilot Program, with the allotment as well as a reappropriation that was deleted. The agency did say that this would still be fully funded for fiscal year 2021 based on the current need from the school districts at the time. So this did not delete the entirety of the program. It simply decreased the overall funding for the program.
It meant if it meets the existing needs, was it just simply over budgeted?
Madam Chair, my understanding was that the funding appropriated was to expand the program beyond the 56 school districts that were participating in the program. The agency would have to speak more to why that expansion did not occur, whether it was the full allotment or whether it was just unneeded funds.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If it's appropriate, I do have a question on page 761.
Will you please turn back to page 761? Senator Erickson.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Under the summary of operating budget, the line item for administration, can you kind of explain why it goes up and down so radically? Thank you.
Certainly, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So that large increase is due to that's where the COVID-19 funding is counted in part in the increased budget. So you see that 41.6 million that was allocated to the children's cabinet, that's going to be in the administration, as well as some other COVID-19 funding. Just the way it's counted in the overall budget, it's being shown in the administration program, and that's why you see that very large increase.
Do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions? Not seeing any additional questions at this time.
All right. So on page 765, you see fiscal year 2022, the budget year. Right at the bottom of the page, I'll note that the agency is requesting a revised estimate of 5.8 billion, including 4.2 billion SGF for fiscal year 2022. This is an all funds increase of 191.1 million, or 3.4% above the fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. It includes an SGF increase of 259.9 million, and now I'm on page 766, or 6.5%, and a special revenue fund decrease of 68.9 million, or 4.1% from the fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. And the request includes an additional FTE position above the fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. Below that, you see kind of a breakdown of, again, those major categories that include those changes. I will note that this breakdown is an increase above, not their total request. So, for example, for state foundation aid, the agency is requesting increased expenditures of 177.7 million. So that's an increase above the prior year, not their total request for that category. And I'll note at the bottom of page 766 that the agency is making additional recommendations and requests. The agency recommends the sunset provision for the high-density at-risk student populations weighting be repealed. The agency requests that the legislature reauthorize the 20 mil property tax levy for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. The 20 mil property tax levy can only be authorized for 2 years at a time, and was last authorized by 2019 House Sub for SB 16 for fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021. And those funds are remitted to the state treasurer and then distributed to school districts as part of their state foundation aid. And on page 767, the agency is also requesting continued authority to allow the director of the budget to transfer funds from the agency's SGF accounts. Proviso language allowing the agency to distribute state aid from the state safety fund whenever funds are available. And the deletion of 79.3 million all SGF for fiscal year 2022 to continue the fiscal year 2021 state foundation aid allotment into fiscal year 2023. The base, which is $4,706, would still be fully funded. And I can either pause there for questions on the agency's request or move on to the governor's recommendation.
Are there questions about the agency's request? Senator Petty.
Thank you. And Norma, could you, when it comes to the state foundation aid, could you reflect back to page 763 and then move through how that's, why that's changing from over each year?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry.
You
Am I
cut
not-
out a
okay.
little.
Okay, could you reflect back on the state foundation aid, how that's changing from year to year and what it's based on?
Certainly, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So state foundation aid is total foundation aid minus the local effort. For total foundation aid, the two driving factors are a weighted FTE enrollment and the base. So you do see a base increase from fiscal year 2021, which is 4,569 to 4,706. The weighted FTE actually saw a decrease in the fall 2020 education consensus estimates for both fiscal year 2021 and for fiscal year 2022. That was primarily driven by the at-risk weighted FTE seeing a decrease due to the school lunch, free school lunch being offered to all students per the USDA waiver, and therefore not requiring that the forms be filled out by each parent. That $79.3 million in particular is actually referring to the funding that was allotted by the governor as part of our fiscal year 2021 allotments. And so this deletion would just extend the delayed payment of state foundation aid into fiscal year 2023. So the allotment delayed a payment for fiscal year 2021, and the agency is just seeking to have that delayed payment continued into the next fiscal year.
Thank you.
Senator Petty, did you have a follow-up? Are there other questions? I do have a request. Final bullet on page 766 is the reauthorization of the 20 mil property tax levy for fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. In this document, I don't think that you provide what the amount is for years prior as far as that 20 mils. Is that something that you could show us what that 20 mils amounted to in the last 5 years, please?
Certainly, Madam Chair, I can get you the last, and you're just looking for the total amount for that 20 mil property tax?
Correct.
All right, and I will note on page 782, there is a breakdown of the state foundation aid. It is only for the actual fiscal year 2020, fiscal years 2021, and fiscal years 2022, but that does include that 20 mil local property tax. But I can certainly provide going back 5 years.
Thank you. I think that would be helpful. People think of the 20 mil being a set amount, but I think even just looking on page 782, you see, folks can see how that is, the actual for 2020 was 709 million, and the estimate for 2021 is 732 million, and the estimate for 2022 is 754, almost 755 million. And so I think it would be helpful for folks to see that even though the amount sets at 20 mils, what it really generates is significantly more. It does change from year to year, and it's going up. So I think that would be helpful for the committee. Thank you.
Certainly.
Are there other questions based on what we have heard so far? Seeing none, I think that we are ready to move to the next section.
Okay. So on 767, you'll note that the governor recommends expenditures of $5.8 billion and $4.2 billion SGF for fiscal year 2022. This is an all funds decrease of $57.6 million or 1%, including an SGF decrease of $45.4 million or 1.1% below the agency's request. This decrease is primarily due to the governor's recommending the adoption of the fall 2020 education consensus estimates, and the governor not recommending the agency's enhancement requests. And the governor does not she recommends one FTE less than the agency's request, and that's attributable to not recommending an enhancement request, which I'll get into a little bit more detail in a second. And I'll note again, under the fall 2020 education consensus estimates, for school finance, the governor recommends decreased expenditures of $18.1 million, including an SGF decrease of about $944,000, below the approved amount. And for capers, a decreased expenditures of 8.3 million, including an SGF decrease of 13.2 million below the approved amount. And then again, you see the individual components for state foundation aid, supplemental state aid, special education, capital outlay, and capital improvements, and then the two capers categories. And then turning to page 769, you'll see the enhancements detailed out. The agency is requesting enhancement funding of 27.0 million, all SGF for fiscal year 2022, for 6 enhancements. Apologies. Those enhancements include special education services state aid, the mental health intervention or MHIT pilot program, the mentor teacher program, career and technical education transportation, the ACT work keys, and the dyslexia coordinator. And I will note that these are broken into 2 separate categories. So those first 4 would be state aid and other assistance enhancement requests, and the second 2 would be under state operations. And the governor does not recommend any of the agency's enhancement requests for fiscal year 2022. Also note that the dyslexia coordinator position was recommended by the Legislative Task Force on Dyslexia that met during the 2020 interim. It was also previously recommended, posted to the 2020 legislature as well. And that position was not approved by the 2020 legislature. And I can pause there for any questions, or I can move on to the reduced resources.
I think we need to pause right there, and just as a point of clarification. So what we have at the top of the page of 769, those are asks coming from the Department of Education for items that the governor has stricken from her recommendation. Is that correct?
So, Madam Chair, members of the committee, these are enhancement requests. They are included in the agency's request. So the overall agency request would include these. The governor's recommendation does not include the enhancement requests. So first comes the agency request, and then the governor takes from the agency's request what the governor chooses to recommend, and the governor is not recommending any of the enhancement requests.
So essentially, the governor is saying with her budget proposal, eliminate the ACT work keys that has been available for students for the last 3 years, eliminate the hiring of anyone with regard to dyslexia coordination. It isn't eliminate the mentor teacher program. It is simply not to expand it. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, yes. So for the MHIT program, that mental health intervention team program, that is again that 3.9 million that the agency is seeking just to fully bring the total funding to the 12.7 million. The ACT work keys, I will note, is also just an additional 600,000. So the agency is seeking to rebid the contract. It ends in at the end of fiscal year 2021. And so when the contract is rebid, the agency is estimating that the cost of the new contract will increase from the current 2.8 million to 3.4 million. So the agency is seeking the additional 600,000 all SGF.
What about the mentor teacher program?
Yes, so the agency is requesting 1 million all SGF for funding the mentor teacher program. And the governor is not recommending that be funded.
That it states that it's for additional funding. So is there going to be funding with the governor's proposed or no funding for the mentor teacher program?
The mentor teacher program would continue its current appropriation of 1.3 million.
First I saw Senator O'Shea, and then we'll go to Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand that this is the governor's recommendation not to, but I guess I was just curious why. Do we ever get to learn that?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I can't speak to the governor's choices. I simply know that the agency requested the funding for these 6 either programs to expend or new positions, and the governor did not recommend any of the enhancements.
Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I noticed that under the ACT work keys section where the governor did not recommend the 600,000 additional, but there is a proviso in the current contract that limits those funds to the amount appropriated. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, members, that is my understanding of the current contract. The current contract ends at the end of the current fiscal year, so at the end of fiscal year 2021.
So it's not that we're going to end that program, it's just if that same amount of funding is there, just not increased. Is that correct?
That's correct. So in the governor's recommendation for the ACT work keys, it would be 2.8 million, which is the current appropriation. The agency seeking an additional 600,000, which the agency believes will be necessary when the contract is rebid beginning in fiscal year 2022.
Thank you.
Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this. I do have a question with some of these enhancements that the governor did not recommend. Is there flexibility with ESSER 2 funding that some of these things could be addressed with that?
Certainly, I can touch on the. Are you, Madam Chair, members of the committee, are you referring to the federal COVID-19 funding received with the elementary and secondary emergency relief fund?
Yes, that's correct. I know we received the first installment, and then I think there's different recommendations in the ESSER 2 or qualifications and maintenance of effort and things. So just wondering if, because I think mentoring and teacher mental health were all aspects in those new ESSER 2 funding.
Certainly. So the Department of Education received $84.5 billion under the CARES Act, under the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, and $369.8 million has preliminarily been allocated under the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation Act, which was passed December 27th. For both of those funding sources, at least 90% must be allocated to school districts or local education agencies, which in Kansas are the school districts. Up to 0.5% may be used for administrative services, and the remainder may be used for emergency needs of the state. For the 9.5% of the CARES Act, the Department of Education has already allocated that funding to be used for special education in fiscal year 2021. And about half of that has been drawn down by those school districts and other program entities. Of the most recent appropriation, you have the same requirement, so at least 90% must be awarded to school districts, and up to 0.5% may be used for administrative services. At this time, I do not know that the Department of Education has planned any uses of the remainder of that ESSER funding that it will receive from the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriation Act. There are 15 purposes outlaid in that law that it may be used for, but my understanding is that the agency understands that there is a requirement that everything be tied to COVID-19. So whether that funding could be used for a program without showing a nexus to the coronavirus pandemic, I do not know, but the agency could speak more to that probably.
We are at time. I know that Senator Dietrich had a question, so if you want to go ahead and ask that question and we'll get that addressed, and then we will need to end our meeting. Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You mentioned special education funding earlier, and that's really what my question was. If we're only funding 69% of excess cost, what did we fund this past year? Is it going down even with the enhancement?
So with the enhancement, it would actually be 72%, not 69. So that enhancement is not included in the consensus estimates. Last year, so for fiscal year 2021, it's at about 72%. And for actual fiscal year 2020, excess costs was funded at 75.3%.
Sorry, could you give us those numbers and the years one more time, please? Starting with
Certainly.
2019.
For fiscal year 2020, there was 75.3% was the excess cost. For fiscal year 2021, under the consensus estimates, the excess cost is about 73.2%. And for fiscal year 2022, with consensus estimates, it would be 68.7%. With the addition of the enhancement request, that would increase to about 72%. But the original estimation, the education consensus estimates, as recommended by the governor, do not include that additional special education funding.
Thank you very much for that. Committee, I suggest that you maybe take this home as homework, look through it, see what questions you have. We'll start our session tomorrow with those questions and we will continue moving through. Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, I know we all have to sign off on this. What is your anticipated date that you're wanting us to be able to make the recommendations to Ways and Means?
We need to have the recommendation, our recommendation, it's my understanding, we need to have it done either the 16th or 17th so that it then gets to Ways and Means.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, our meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.